Drum tracking. So you want to determine at the beginning of a project, depending on who's in the band, what the budget of the band is, what sort of space you're going to be working in, what kind of equipment that you're working with, whether you want to track the band in the traditional way where the band is playing live together, or whether you want to track the drummer playing by themselves with maybe either a scratch guitar and or bass playing along with them, or in the case of some bands, they might have, like the last band I recorded, for example, they were, they have some recording skill themselves, and they ended up actually demoing their whole record on a click track, and they came into me with scratch tracks of the guitars already recorded, and click tracks and vocals and bass and everything already recorded, which is kind of neat. It didn't allow me to have my 2 cents as much because it was already sort of set what the song was going to be, but it was great for the drummer because he had been rehearsing to the same exact performances that he was recording to, so it went along pretty quickly. So that's if you're doing scratch tracks, that's one thing that you can ask the band to do if they have the time and the know-how. In the case of live recording, in my particular studio where it's kind of small, I'm not able to really easily isolate the amplifiers from the drum set, and so I end up recording everybody in the same room together like it's a band practice, and I will, so there's just bleed into everything. So if one person messes up, pretty much you got to start over, or punch in or something like that. Sometimes I'll edit takes together, but for the most part, what you see is what you get. The nice thing about that live tracking is that as you're engineering it, while you have a whole lot more stuff to manage and think about as you're recording it, and maybe some of the details slip through, you also have a much better understanding of what the big picture is. And I think you can actually be a little bit more aggressive in your EQ and compression choices when you're tracking, because you really understand how the drums and guitar and bass and maybe the vocals, if they're doing live vocals, are going to work together. And of course, the drawback is that you can't put as much attention on any one sound or any one performance, and if the band isn't super well rehearsed, then the problem I always get is the bass player is playing something on the 4th fret and the guitar player is on the 3rd fret, and then he's like, "No, that's how you showed it to me." And you can't always pick up that stuff when you're doing live tracking, and like you can when you're doing a scratch guitar track along with the drum set. And then the other thing is just the acoustic space that you're working in, and so like I said, in my studio, when I'm recording a band live, and I don't really have a place to put amps, so everything's bleeding into everything else, and I can't have a dedicated room mic on the guitar because the guitar is going to bleed into the drums. I can't really do a whole lot of room micing on the drums because the guitar and bass just sort of take over the room sound, so it's really got to nail the close mics and the overheads on the drum set and get the majority of my tone from that. And if I want to get a roomy drum tone, I'm going to be using some sort of artificial reverb. But that's kind of okay for a lot of projects. And if the feel and the interaction between the players is more important to making a great record in this case than the tones and being meticulous about their performances, then that can be the way to go. The majority of the records that I do are some sort of scratch instrument along with the drum set, but I've been just as happy with live recordings as I have been with more meticulous studio recordings. And the other advantage to a live recording, especially if a band is on a tight budget, is that it just all goes quite a bit faster. There's less you can do with it, so there's less that you do with it. So you just kind of get through it all faster. You're kind of building your mix as you're tracking. So it goes really quickly. So I enjoy recording that way a lot, and I hope someday I hope to maybe move to a larger studio that I can do more live tracking easily at. So the next thing to think about is whether or not you're going to use a click track. I feel as though click tracks are getting more and more common in music, and I find I very rarely request that a band use a click track. I will occasionally request that they rehearse to a click track in advance of coming into the session, but I very rarely will ask them to do it if they're not already comfortable with it. But a lot of bands now come in asking me for a click track. Sometimes they even come in with like MIDI files of of tempo maps that they've made themselves because they know that they want to do that. And there's a lot to be said for using one. If maintaining a steady tempo is really important to the song, it's cool. Or if you have a drummer that easily lets the tempo get away from them, sometimes you want to reel them in a little bit, and the click track can be beneficial. There's quite a few downsides of a click track. I'm going to tell you a couple of them, and also how to get some workarounds to that. So the big downside for me is if a drummer's not comfortable playing on a click track, they start playing very conservatively. They go from being a hard hitter to a light hitter or a medium hitter. And they go from being sort of adventurous with their fills to very conservative with their fills because they're afraid that they're going to lose the click. So getting a great headphone mix for them where they can hear themselves, hear the other musicians, and hear the click track well, but also so there's not too much click bleeding into the overheads and the room mics is crucial. Now, personally, I love the feel of natural drummer fluctuation. Like fluctuations in tempo and volume and stuff is what gets me excited about music. But I hate the feel of a drummer compensating for having got off a click. So, you might be at a certain tempo, the drummer's rocking out, and then a triplet fill comes out, and every drummer slows down triplet fills. So all of a sudden now you're like a 30-second note behind the beat, which I don't care if they slow down that fill, but now the beat following that fill, they need to speed back up to compensate for the fact that they fell off on that fill. And I hate hearing that. So the two ways to sort of get around that are either spend some time building a kind of a complicated tempo map of the song where you're like, oh, okay, here's the triplet fill, and I know the drummer's going to slow down 5 BPM here, so let's drop the tempo and then bring it back up to tempo on the beat following the fill. And we want to add a little excitement to the chorus, so let's kick it up a couple BPM, and then the bridge a couple BPM more. Maybe the last verse, just as a result of all that stuff, is a couple BPM faster than the first verse. It takes a while to sort of build a tempo map that follows the drummer's natural tendencies to sort of if their tempo, if this is no tempo fluctuation and this is their normal tempo fluctuation, maybe you want to bring it into here, where the song feels steadier than it was to begin with, but isn't totally inhumanly dead. The other thing you can do is do grid-based editing, which in Pro Tools is called Beat Detective, and it's a pretty useful tool. I use it regularly for situations where they really want a rigid tempo through the whole song, but there's some tempo fluctuations between fills or beats or whatever. Or the other thing that happens a lot is if a drum track is composed of multiple takes edited together. It might be that on take 1, they're playing a little behind the beat, and on take 2, they're playing a little ahead of the beat, and you want to marry those two takes together at the splice point between the two takes. You've got this side is a little ahead, or a little behind, this side's a little ahead. The only way to really effectively marry that and maintain its correlation to the click track is to do a little bit of grid-based editing to kind of join that stuff together. And a lot of times I'll choose to vary the strength of Beat Detective, which is to say 50%, which will nudge it in the right direction, but not sort of lock it exactly to the grid. If you're trying to integrate some electronic drums in with acoustic drums, then 100% to the grid, sort of the way to go. Otherwise, you end up with some flammy stuff happening between acoustic and electric drums. But I do try to avoid that stuff if I can. And the song that's the example for this class was not done on a click. So I don't actually have a good example of that grid-based editing. Okay, so let's see. I have one more. Oh, there was a little bit of, you did hear on the intro to the previous segment where there was some drum tracking happening. You did hear some stuff with a click that was actually from a different song. So this song, not on a click. Talk a little bit about fills, and I'm mentioning the voice again because sometimes drums are a hook. Sometimes someone comes up with a drum thing that's not just a beat, but it's really a drum riff, and it's a fill or it's a hook or some kind of thing that is the focus of the song, so don't lose sight of that. Sometimes you want to automate the drums up a little bit in those areas just to feature the drum set. But you also want to be aware of when to fill and when not to fill. And sometimes a drummer is, sometimes drummers don't really care what genre of music they're playing. They're just like, yeah, there's like stuff that I can do fills over, and like, you know, that's like why they're there. They just like to, so make sure that you know, you help guide them so that their fills are not distracting from the voice. So if there's like a, you know, the hook is the vocal or some guitar lead or something like that, there's a time for drum fills, and there's a time for a drummer to just be in the service industry and just be paving the way, but not distracting from what else is happening. So yeah, and then choice of cymbal again. You know, cymbals sort of paint moods. You know, you have, or even to not use a cymbal at all. Like if you're recording, like a lot of like classic Neil Young stuff, the acoustic guitar sort of takes the role of the hi-hat, and the drummer's just playing kick and snare. Pixies too. A lot of times he's just playing kick and snare, and like acoustic guitar is filling the role of the crisp thing that's riding steadily. So you want to think riff to riff, part to part. What's the cymbal choice that's going to present the best forward momentum to the song and keep the song most exciting? It's really a pet peeve of mine when two cymbals are used, or excuse me, one cymbal is used two riffs in a row. You know, like if the verse is on hi-hat, you know, the chorus should be on ride, or chorus should be on crash, or and then the verse should be on ride, or you know, whatever it is, just arrange it so that you're not constantly staying on one cymbal. And you know, it's great when a drummer can you know, can do that on the fly in the studio, but it's also something they should hopefully will plan out in advance and really know that they want to be on the hi-hat for the verse and the ride for the chorus. Hopefully you're working with a drummer that can compensate on the fly if you catch some kind of little continuity error like that. And then I want to talk a little bit about drum editing. A lot of people will save all of their drum editing for the end. I really try to avoid that, A, because just to avoid doing too much editing all at once and getting carpal tunnel. But I think that it's crucial to do drum editing before you break down your drum setup. Because a lot of times you realize like, oh yeah, I can just fix that later by editing it, and then you realize, oh wait a second, like I can't really do that because I thought he was on the right crash, but he was actually on the left crash, and when I do this edit, like all of a sudden this like decay from another crash cymbal will disappear or appear, or you know, or maybe like, you know, the take is not quite there and you want to edit it to perfect the take, but you might edit it to death and still not get there, and it'd be better for the drummer just to replay it. So I think it's really a good idea to do all of your edits on the fly and make sure, it doesn't have to be before you leave that song, but it should definitely be before you leave that drum sound. And if you do find yourself going back after the fact to drop in a little section of drums that you couldn't edit the way that you want to, double check your tuning and make sure that especially the snare has the same pitch that it did when you were tracking in the body of that song. Because I've been sent a lot of stuff to mix where, you know, it's like do do da do do dong 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 ding dong dong ding, and it's just like super frustrating, and then it makes you want to use sound replacement just to get a consistent tone, and I do try to avoid that if I can. So yeah, do the edits on the fly, and as you're doing them, make sure you do them in a way that preserves the cymbal decay. So like, you know, let's say someone messed up a verse and you want to punch them in on the verse, have them play along with the part before the verse. Don't just have them start on the verse, because if they start on the verse and the part before the verse ended with like a, you know, a tom roll, now all of a sudden when you splice in at the verse, that floor tom decay will all of a sudden disappear because they weren't playing along with it prior to the splice point. So just do everything you can to preserve that sense of continuity. And also people play better and play differently for sure when they are playing with a sense of continuity. And that holds true for any instrument, but especially with drums. One final thought on drum editing, and I want to switch over to Pro Tools for a second and do a quick little well, not quite demonstration, but just like a little visual thing. So I'm just going to zoom in on my, this is the very first hit of the song. So let's see, still zooming. All right, so right here, if you can see this cursor, I'm going to actually select it to all so the cursor's a little bigger. But so the first hit of the song is a snare drum. All right, and I'm going to zoom the height of this a little bit too, so you can see where. Oh, I'm in samples right now. I'm going to go back to minutes and seconds. So you can kind of see a timing offset between the top and bottom snare mic. We're going to talk more about that later. So the snare is arriving. You can sort of see where the snare arrives at each microphone. So there's a little bit of a delay before it gets to the rack tom, another little bit more delay before it gets to the floor tom, a little more delay before it gets to the overhead, pretty big delay before it gets to that close room mic, which was a mono AEA N22 in front of the kit. And then there's this big delay before we get to, this looks like about 15 millisecond delay before we get to the big room mic. And remember that number, 15 milliseconds, it's going to come up tomorrow as well. So before I edit the drum set, let's say, I'm going to shrink this down a little bit again just so I can see what's going on a little better, but let's see if I can find like a drum fill, like a roll or something. I don't know if he does anything with that. There's some stuff, this little build-up thingy. So like, look how, a little tough to see, but you can see how skewed you know, this like 15 millisecond offset is, or maybe more like 20 millisecond offset is from the close mic attack. What I like to do when I'm editing, if I end up doing any grid-based editing, especially before I do my edits, I like to slide. I'm going to go back to the beginning. I like to slide. Oh, you can really see it actually on the stick clicks here. I like to slide these. The overheads, or not, actually, definitely the room mics, maybe not the overheads, but I'll slide the room mics back in time just a little bit before I start editing. So off. So let's take my close mic, and I'm going to say 5 milliseconds. I'm in shuffle mode right now, so when I delete, it's going to pull the track back. And I'm going to go into the big room, and I'm going to say a 15 millisecond offset. Delete, and that pulls that track back. So I'm not going to leave it like this for mixing, but now you can see that the tracks, the peak of the transient lines up a lot better with the track. So in the case of like some dense stuff like this, when I do, like right now I'm doing tab to transient and then B to separate region. I'm just going to sort of tab out each, well that's a flam, so I think it's a flam, so it's kind of one drum hit, but I sort of missed the transient there. But you know, as I tab this out, if I hadn't slid the room mics back, then the transient would be appear on the big room stuff would sort of be appearing in the middle of this clip, rather than the transient from the big room being at the beginning of the clip. So when you get into some really fast stuff, you can end up with these weird phantom snare rings or kick pops that you don't want to hear. If you scoot those tracks back, it sort of it lines up all the transients so that your editing will be more accurate. And then after you complete any grid-based editing that you do, if you remember what your offset was, you can come back over here and push it back to where it was originally, and then restore the performance. But now just it's sort of skewed where the splice point is on those ambient tracks, and I find that it makes for a much cleaner type of edit.